To learn or not learn about the brain? That is the question. Oh hey Bio30s, just practicing my Shakespeare. I am back again for another lesson and we will be learning about the parts of the brain today. So in our last lesson we discussed synapses and how neurons can form connections. Today's lesson we're going to focus primarily on the central nervous system. We'll go over the spinal cord just a little bit, but mostly talking about the different parts of the brain. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So you want to think the center of your body, central nervous system. And this is where you'll find your interneurons. So in your interneurons, in your spinal cord, in your brain, you'll find your interneurons. They are kind of the midpoint, the integration piece between sensory and motor neurons. Now, when we look at your central system as a whole, your brain is surrounded by 3 protective membranes. It's also surrounded by fluid and it's also surrounded by a skull. A lot of protection around that brain. Your spinal cord also has a lot of protection as well. So there's some membranes, there's your vertebrae, and there's also the cerebrospinal fluid. If you remember back to our neuron first lesson when we talked about gray matter and white matter, I told you that white matter contains myelin and gray matter is no myelin. So in your spinal cord, you do have both. You have white matter and you have gray matter. Now, if you were to take your spinal cord and essentially slice it and get a cross section of it, you'd see sensory neurons going in, motor neurons going out. You'd actually find the white matter on the outside of your spinal cord, and you'd find the gray matter on the inside. So the myelinated neurons would be on the outside, the gray matter, the unmyelinated neurons would be on the inside. Now, if we take a look at your brain, white matter versus gray matter, it's about a 40-60 split between white matter and gray matter, but what you'll notice is it's actually the inverse of your spinal cord. You actually find your white matter on the inside of your brain and your gray matter on the outside of your brain. Now, the difference here is really just speed, right? When it comes down to things like quick relaying information, basically getting the information where it needs to go quickly, sending information across different lobes, across different hemispheres to different parts of the body. That's all white matter, right? Myelin allows the signal to go faster. Gray matter is more for processing the information. We're processing what we're seeing. We're processing what we're hearing. We're processing what we're smelling. That's what your gray matter is there for. So processing with your gray matter and then relaying, sending signals with your white matter. Now, when we look at the parts of the brain, we can divide the brain up first into 3 major sections. So I'm going to do that right here for you. The first section of the brain is our largest section. It's known as the forebrain. So the forebrain is the large section of the brain there, mostly primarily made up of the cerebrum. We'll get to that in a second. And then on the inside, we have things like the corpus callosum, the thalamus, we have the olfactory bulb, the hypothalamus, the pituitary. These are all things that make up your forebrain. But yes, the largest portion of your brain there is going to be your forebrain. Your midbrain is this little piece here. So it's very small. It's the in-between between the forebrain and the third piece, which is the hindbrain. So this back piece here is known as the hindbrain. So I'll add that in there, hindbrain. And the hindbrain contains the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So when you first start developing, the very first thing you develop is actually your hindbrain. It's often called our reptilian brain. It's our most primitive, basic part of our brain. It controls things like your autonomic breathing, swallowing, autonomic life functions, like the automatic functions, right? And then even if you go from say 1 month old to 3 month old, we see a massive change as that forebrain just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more developed. If you specifically look at your forebrain, you can actually notice that there's 2 separate sides to it, or hemispheres we call them. We call them the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And they actually do different things. So the left side and the right side, they actually do different things when we look at the brain. So the left side of your brain can do things related to things like logic, sequence, facts, numbers, following directions, whereas the right side is more creative, emotional, holistic, things like that. And the nice thing is, if we go back to our original diagram here, is while both sides of your brain essentially do different things, It's the corpus callosum in the middle that allows both sides to talk to one another. So you can actually share information across hemispheres. So the left and the right brain can share information. This is also an interesting fact for you. It's only the left side of your brain that has the ability to produce speech. So the left side of your brain has the ability, it has the speech center in it, whereas the right side doesn't. But the right side is able to recognize faces where the left side cannot. So it's a combination of the two sides that allows our brain to function at max capacity, essentially. Now, if we look at your cerebrum and you were to divide that cerebrum up, you would notice there's 4 lobes. There's the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. So each lobe is then divided into what it can do, right? So each lobe has a different sensation it takes care of, or a different part of processing that it incorporates. So if we look at all of these lobes here, they're related to our 5 senses, as well as things like behavior, decision-making, muscle movement. Basically, anytime we want to run something, our cerebrum is calling the shot. So the cerebrum is taking in all this information, processing it, and then deciding what we need to do next. So let's start down here with the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is known for smell and hearing. So any sensation coming in from your nose or your ears is processed in the temporal lobe. So for example, you're going to hear a sound, you're going to hear some type of noise, and then in a different area of the temporal lobe, you're going to identify that noise. And if it's something you've never heard before, then you're unable to identify it. Same thing with vision. In the occipital lobe, you're going to process what you see, and then you're going to associate that. So for example, right, this is a plastic skull. You would associate what you're seeing here with the word plastic skull. But if you've never seen this before, you don't have that association. So that's the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe is for speech, a little bit of speech there, but once again, only on the left side. Taste and touch as well. Anything related to touch, temperature, sensation, that's going to be parietal lobe. And the big one here, the frontal lobe, that is for a little bit more speech, but mostly fine muscle movement, behavior, reasoning, personality, decision making. That's all frontal lobe. Out of the 4, you can probably guess which one takes the longest to develop. It's going to be that frontal lobe. For most people, your frontal lobe isn't developed fully until your 20s or 30s, and it's actually different for males and females. So females, your frontal lobe, probably developed around your early 20s, fully developed, I should say. And for males, it's not until your late 20s or 30s where you actually have a fully developed frontal lobe. So as we move on here, we're going to get into the inside pieces of the brain. So we have the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the pituitary gland. With these pieces, these are more for control, relaying, homeostasis. So the thalamus, this is your relay center. So remember, all those signals coming in from your spinal cord, they're going to go into your thalamus. And then from the thalamus, they'll relay to the appropriate lobe. So here's an example for you, and we'll talk more about this in our next lesson when we discuss how we see. But when nerve signals go through the eye and through the optic nerve, they'll first enter into the thalamus. From the thalamus, that signal will be sent to the occipital lobe because that's the lobe that processes vision. You wouldn't want to send it to the frontal lobe because it wouldn't process it properly. So the thalamus is kind of like, I like to think of it like, back in the day, if you've ever seen like switchboard operators where they'd actually connect calls and do things like that. It's kind of like that, where we have information coming in from the eye. Okay, let's send it to the occipital lobe. Oh, we got information from the foot. Okay, let's send it to the parietal lobe. Now, hypothalamus and pituitary, I won't go over in much detail right now because there'll be another lesson on them later when we talk about hormones, but really they're the primary hormone control of your body. There's other glands, there's other places we make hormones, of course, but the hypothalamus, the pituitary, they make quite a few hormones for our body. So the hypothalamus is kind of like your control center. I like to think of it like the thermostat of the body. It's kind of, oh, all right, we need a little bit more of that hormone. Oh, we can shut that hormone off. Oh, we need a little bit more. Oh, we can shut that one off. So it's kind of calling the shots, and the pituitary is the one releasing the hormones. Now, there are some hormones that the hypothalamus does make, like oxytocin and ADH, but for the most part, it's the hypothalamus activating the pituitary, and the pituitary is then making those hormones and releasing them. For the midbrain, not a whole lot going on with the midbrain there. It's way less developed than the forebrain. It's It's mostly gray matter. It does control your eye and ear reflexes, and it does serve as kind of a link between the forebrain and the hindbrain. And then when we finish off here at the hindbrain, the three main pieces once again are your cerebellum, your pons, and your medulla oblongata. Now the cerebellum is there, it kind of looks like that weird cauliflower shaped thing. Now not to be confused with the cerebrum, I do that all the time, cerebrum, cerebellum, they are two different things. The cerebellum is used for balance, coordination, and muscle tone. So if you want to maintain your balance, if you're doing something where you want to topple over, if you want to use your coordinated skills, you would then need your cerebellum to essentially keep you upright and stop you from tripping or falling over or losing your balance. Then connecting the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata would be the pons. The pons is essentially a bridge, right? It is the connection or the relay center between the cerebellum and the medulla. And finally, medulla oblongata, think autonomic nervous system, things like breathing, heart rate, swallowing. It's your basic life functions. So once again, we have our forebrain. Most of the forebrain is cerebrum, split into our four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Then on the inside, we have our corpus callosum, allowing our two sides to talk. We have the thalamus being your relay center, hypothalamus and pituitary for hormones. It's not shown here in the diagram, but right about here would be the olfactory bulb. That's actually used for smell. So the olfactory bulb is used for smell. Then we have our midbrain here, connecting to our hindbrain, made of our cerebellum, our pons, and our medulla oblongata. So next lesson, we're going to talk about how one of these sensations is actually processed. We're going to talk about how your eye works, how the process of sight works, and then how that information is going to be sent from your eyes through your optic nerve into your thalamus and then out into your occipital lobe. So thanks again for watching, and we'll chat soon.